This upcoming session is part of San Diego Grantmakers Diversity Initiative, and we are really fortunate to have been received funding for our diversity initiative by both the California Endowment and the James Irvine Foundation. James Surowiecki is the foremost authority on how to harness the collective wisdom of organizations for competitive advantage. In his best-selling book, The Wisdom of Crowds, which, as I said, some of you just won, he is the New Yorker columnist James Surowiecki advances a powerful and possibly counterintuitive claim that large groups of people are better at solving problems than a few. Following James' presentation, we have the privilege of hearing from Dr. Robert Ross, who is the President and Chief Executive Officer for the California Endowment. Dr. Ross has extensive knowledge in the area of health and human services, and we are so privileged to have him here. So I'm going to bring up James Surowiecki, and please enjoy the plenary.
Thanks. Thanks. So I guess I'll start by just telling you a story, which is the first story in my book. And it's the story of a British scientist, a guy named Francis Galton. So some of you may know who Francis Galton is. He is famous for being the founder, in some ways, of what we think of as sort of modern statistical analysis. He was one of the first people to really think hard about how you could use statistical analysis to think about kind of social behavior, social groups, actually even down to kind of individuals. But he's also infamous for being the founder of what we now know as eugenics. So he was someone who was really a notorious elitist. He basically thought that only a very few people in the world had the capabilities that were necessary to make good decisions and solve problems and so on. So about a century ago, Galton was wandering through a country fair in the west of England. And this was a fair much like the ones we have here in the States. So people would come, they'd bring their produce and livestock and show it off to each other. And as he was walking through the fair that day, he came across this contest. And the contest was that an ox had been placed on display. And people were lined up to guess the weight of the ox. So you'd pay like 6 pence, and the best guesses would win prizes. So there was some incentive for people to try to do a good job of guessing the weight of this ox. So as Galton described it, the crowd that day was actually a very big one. Something like 700 people actually lined up to try to guess the weight of this ox. And it was also, and this is important, it was also a crowd. So some of the people in the crowd were butchers and farmers, and you can consider them in some sense kind of experts in the task. But a lot of people in the crowd were not experts. They were, local merchants or family members, just people who were out there to have a nice day at the fair and who were just, kind of taking a flyer on this question. So after the contest was over, Galton took all of the guesses and he ran a series of statistical tests on them. And then he did something very simple, which was he just took the average of the group's guesses. And now that number represented, I'll say, the kind of collective wisdom of the group. So if it had been one person, that's how much it would have guessed the ox had weighed. So Galton thought that the crowd's guess, when he did this, he thought that the crowd's guess was going to be way off the mark. Because in his mind, as I said, he was this elitist, so in his mind what you were doing was you were taking the guesses of a few smart people, then a few mediocre people, and a lot of morons, because he basically thought everyone was dumb, basically. So that collectively what you were going to end up with was a very flawed estimate. But in fact, Francis Galton was wrong, because the crowd had guessed that the ox would weigh 1,197 pounds. And when all was said and done, the ox weighed 1,198 pounds. So that in other words, the crowd's judgment was essentially perfect. And what that means is that if you can figure out ways to tap into the collective intelligence of your team, your organization, and I think in the case of philanthropy in particular, the collective intelligence of the community at large, the community that you're trying to serve, but also the community of grant makers, you can actually dramatically improve your ability, solve problems, make decisions, and even in certain circumstances do a better job of kind of forecasting the future. That is to say, figuring out what will work in the future. The key is what makes a crowd wise. And there are a number of conditions, and I'll talk about them. There are really 3. But the most important of them, and the one I'm going to spend most of my time talking about today, is really diversity. Diversity is really what makes collective judgment smart. And so what we'll talk about is why that is important, why it works, and then also the challenges that it presents. Because although diversity is something that is incredibly valuable. It can also be, I think, incredibly challenging to make work in an organization, in a community, and the like. So Google, for instance, is actually an example of the wisdom of crowds in action, which is to say that the way Google's search engine basically works is effectively by surveying the internet as a whole and asking it which web pages are most likely to have the information you want. So when you type a search into Google, what it basically does is goes out and looks at the internet, and it treats a link from one web page to another as a vote on the value of that page. And it aggregates all those links, adds some Google special sauce or whatever, and comes out with its answer. And, if you think about the net, again, wonderful as it is, you don't have to pass any intelligence test to start a website or to link from one website to another. So you might think if you aggregated all those links, that what you would end up with is, chaos or stupidity. But what Google's founders realized, and this was, really from the start, was that underneath that seeming surface chaos, there really is a kind of remarkable hidden order and a remarkable hidden intelligence. So they basically have built this incredibly successful and to my mind at least, incredibly useful business by tapping the collective intelligence of the net. I don't think the key to the wisdom of crowds is the specific tool that you use. I think the key is really the principle. That what you're trying to do is cast your net as widely as possible. And you're trying to incorporate as many diverse and independent points of view as you can. And this is a rule, I think, that applies both on the micro level, so it applies even in smaller groups, where the wisdom of crowds can actually make a big difference in terms of making that group's judgments bigger. And it applies on sort of the macro level as well, so that I think the general rule is we don't always know who has the information and the knowledge that we're looking for. A lot of times, knowledge doesn't rest in the hands of one person or a small number of people. A lot of times, it's sort of distributed. Lots of different people have little pieces of the puzzle. And if you can find ways to bring all those pieces together, then you're actually going to end up with a much better sense of what you should be doing than otherwise. And I think the way to avoid it is to make sure that your group satisfies the kind of conditions that define wise crowds. I think there are three basic conditions. The first is pretty simple, and I sort of call it aggregation. By that, all I mean is that what you want to do is take lots of different individual judgments and put them together to come up with a kind of collective judgment. The other problem we have when it comes to independence is that we all want to appear like we know what we're talking about, right? We all want to appear reasonable in the eyes of our peers or our colleagues, or if we have bosses, in the eyes of our bosses or the like. And this is true even even in a community environment. If you want to appear reasonable in the eyes of your community. And so one of the things that happens is in groups is that people are oftentimes uncomfortable or anxious about offering up opinions that are really different from what other people in the group seem to be saying. And so as a result, what tends to happen is more extreme, I mean that in the good sense, so ideas that are maybe further out there or judgments that are further out there oftentimes get kind of quashed. Not even explicitly, sometimes they just don't even arise. Diversity adds value in a plethora of ways. The first way it adds value is pretty straightforward. It just expands the range of information you have available to you. And if you have a diverse group, the reality is that information is oftentimes going to be exceptionally good in its actual picture of the world. Now, the last place where diversity really helps is it really helps in terms of group dynamics, especially with smaller groups. So one of the challenges smaller groups have is, and this is a real problem in the way organizations work, is that we tend to like to work with people like us. Right? We tend to like to work with people who we agree with because it's just more comfortable that way. It's easier to do, everyone sort of gets along, everything seems to run more smoothly and the like. So oftentimes we end up, oftentimes unconsciously, in homogeneous groups. And this would be fine except for one fact, which is that with a homogeneous group, generally speaking, the more time you spend together and the more you talk to each other, the dumber you become. What you're really trying to create an environment in which people are willing and able to disagree with each other, but also in which they really respect and trust each other. Now, that's easier said than done, I realize. But if you can get that, that's really the way that you can truly reap the great benefits of the wisdom of crowds. So, thank you very much. Want to just come up?
First of all, thank you for San Diego Grantmakers. And this is probably, as some of you know, the California Endowment, we've been at the forefront of matters of promoting diversity in our field and in the nonprofit sector. And this particular presentation we just heard was as powerful an argument for diversity as I've heard, and I've heard a lot of them. A couple of thoughts. One is within our boardroom, and we actually we've just imposed on ourselves an audit, a diversity audit. We've talked a lot about diversity in the field, but we've never said, well, you know, what would benchmarking excellence and diversity really look like? So we actually put ourselves through that, and again, diversity on a broad definition. But on our boardroom, we have a very diverse board, and it is diverse racially and ethnically and gender-wise, geographically. And the one example I want to bring up is actually age, which we had never really thought about in terms of diversity until our most recent board member edition, which was about 3 years ago. And we realized that the average age of our board member was between 55 and 60, and we had never, in the now 14 or 15 years at the California, we had never had an under age 40 board member. And so we found one. And this particular young person has had in his career, he's forged a path where he is really knowledgeable about the world of investing, but it's about pro-social, good doing investing. And it was Stephen's perspective about the world of investment, and you just asked in the boardroom some very poignant questions about our philosophy of investing and our philosophy of grant making, and said, well, you know, why not? And to make a long story short, because we actually had an environment where he wasn't, you know, the crazy Bob, the outlier Bob that you referred to, but actually just authentic, respectful listening. And we actually went through a period of some conflict in the boardroom about whether we should designate a portion of our corpus that would typically go to traditional investing for mission investing. And to make a long story short, we got there. I mean, after a couple of years of this kind of medium to high conflict but respectful exchange, the issue of trust. As many of you know, trust is the foundation for successful programming, and particularly sustainable programming. And reaching out into the crowds, of course, is a way of sort of building trust. You know, so the first idea is powerful. The second is trust building, and the third is what James didn't mention. I wouldn't expect him to, and it's actually good that he didn't say it. And that is the matter of justice and equity. I think innovation is overhyped. Innovation is really important, okay? In the for-profit sector, innovation scales really quickly because greed is a powerful scaler, right? I mean, money making is a very powerful way to scale, okay? And so, you know, iPads scale and iPhones scale very quickly, okay? Social innovation doesn't have that kind of lever. And a lot of us have been in the business of funding stuff that works with evaluations that show it works, and you can't scale the idea. Our problem is not finding innovation. Our problem primarily is when we find something that actually works at solving a social problem, we can't scale it. That's the harder thing. That's not an innovation problem, that's a power problem. I'd love to see you apply some of the thinking you brought to this issue of advocacy and power and scaling, because innovation is not our challenge. We have successful homeless programs, we have successful public school, go see the movie Waiting for Superman. It is about models at work. The problem is scaling those up.
Thank you, both.